Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for attending this event today. And I'd like to start by introducing myself. I'm Anas Al-Tikriti. I'm the CEO and founder of the Cordoba Foundation, which is hosting this event, this conference. I'd like to thank everyone here, yourselves for making the time, and also our panelists for today, our speakers, and also a thanks to the sponsors of the event, whom I'll be mentioning once or twice throughout this evening. The partners of this event: Save Tunisian Democracy, the Muslim Association Britain, Forward Thinking, the Prince Al Walid bin Talal Center for Christian Muslim Understanding, and Alhiwar TV. So thank you for every one of them for supporting this cause and for sponsoring this event. I'd also like to, at the very top, thank the organizers and our hosts for this evening events at number 6. This is a brilliant venue, and I haven't been paid to promote them, but I think that the facilities and the service that we've received since we've arrived, I think that speaks for itself. The theme of today, I don't think, needs much illustration and much description. We're here today in order to speak up for democracy in Tunis. Tunisia, 12 years ago, more than 12 years ago, began a historic phase in not only the history of the region, the Middle East and the MENA region, but actually I would go as far as to say it started a historic time in the history of all of us around the world. The fact that in Tunis, in early January 2011, a peaceful, consistent, incessant demonstration by Tunisians, all Tunisians, of all ideological backgrounds, of all ages, of all professions, came onto the streets and made a very, very simple demand. They wanted change. They wanted change. Not a single item was used to create any kind of violent attacks. It was a peaceful demonstration. The demands were peaceful, and ultimately, the system at the time crumbled and fell. This, in our lives, is something almost unheard of. Quickly followed by what happened in Egypt, and all of a sudden, we had the Arab Spring. Everyone, if you recall, and I recall very, very well, traveling around the world, from Geneva to Paris to Washington to Sydney, and in every single one of those cities and capitals around the world, finding something called the Occupy movement, which mimicked the Arab Spring, saying, this is our Arab Spring, this is our Jasmine Revolution, this is our Maidan al-Tahrir. That was something that was truly remarkable. And we mustn't ever forget that we as a people, we managed to defy all odds. We managed to come out peacefully, all together, undivided, call for change, and change happened. And change happened. That's something that gave hope to all nations, to all people. And all of a sudden, the MENA region, the Middle East and North African region, wasn't synonymous with violence and conflict and terrorism and backwardness. All of a sudden, that region, those people, were iconic of peaceful change and peaceful revolutions. Today, we have, unfortunately, a totally different scenery. Today, we have an elected president who decided to kick off and kick away the ladder which got him to Carthage Palace, and decided to stop, to bring to a halt the cycle of democracy and the struggle for democracy. and to instigate a situation which can only be described as another dictatorship in a region that is rife with dictatorships, and bring Tunis back to way before the 2011 Arab Spring and the Jasmine Revolution. So today we have an illustrious panel of experts and of families of those who are now languishing in prison. I'm glad and happy and proud to say that we have two families representing their fathers who are languishing in prison today, arrested for farcical charges, absolutely unbelievable to anyone who knows anything about the two men that we'll be speaking about today and whose daughters will be addressing this audience throughout this evening. Without further ado, the running order will be as follows. Actually, not the running order, but the way in which we'll be doing this is that I will be asking our speakers to speak for between 5 and 7 minutes. And I'll try to be a little bit strict on time. After which, I'll invite either yourself to ask a question, or maybe I'll throw in something for sort of a wrap-up. And we'll move from one speaker to another as such. And then towards the end, if we have enough time, maybe we'll open to the audience for any questions that you have. But once again, my thanks, gratitude, and appreciation to each and every one of you, and also to our panelists and speakers. And I'd like to also, before we start with our first speaker, I'd like to thank our media sponsors for today, Alhiwar TV, as well as Al Jazeera Mubashir. And we have with us several online platforms that are conveying this event. This event is also being live streamed on YouTube. So we have also an audience that's watching these proceedings as they unfold. So without further ado, I'd like to firstly start with Rodney Dixon. Rodney is from Temple Garden Chambers. He's a barrister representing Tunisian opposition leaders detained in Tunisia. And I'm starting with Rodney because I'm aware of the fact that he has an engagement shortly after 7 o'clock, so he'll unfortunately be leaving us. So over to you, Rodney.
Thank you so much, and welcome this evening. We are trying as much as we can to talk about the legal steps that we are taking on behalf of those who are detained, those who have been targeted in Tunisia by the current government. Because it's so important, even though many of these steps are taking place in courtrooms and in parliaments, that we all know about them and support them as widely as we can. It's through that process that there'll be a greater urgency on those who have to make very important decisions about the serious human rights violations that are taking place. So I wanted to briefly this evening explain what we are doing as lawyers on behalf of the families of those detained, on behalf of the detainees, and those who have been the subject of this most recent crackdown, but also what has been occurring over a number of months and years. It has culminated now in a heightened focus on, across the board, silencing any opposition and dissent to the current regime. First of all, in order to try and highlight who's responsible for this, we have made applications for sanctions to be imposed on the individuals who are responsible for these violations. Where there's evidence pointing to those, particularly those who are most responsible at the top of the hierarchy, we have asked the government here in the United Kingdom to impose sanctions on those individuals. We've also done the same in the EU as well, at the European Parliament. and an initiative has been taken in the United States as well. So it crosses a wide section of the world, and the effect of it, if they are to be imposed, and we hope that they will, because it's the right thing to do, would be that those persons would not be able to travel and continue business as usual around the world. Their bank accounts and those of their associates and companies can be tracked down and frozen. And they can't keep doing transactions in our countries as though everything is normal. We have focused in particular on the current President Said, as well as a number of his key ministers, the Minister of Interior, the Minister of Defense, and other key state officials who are directly involved in implementing this campaign of repression. Of course, they are using many more people down the ladder, but we are going for those who are giving the orders, who are overseeing it, who are most responsible. Where the evidence points to them, and we provided that evidence in the applications, then they are the ones who should bear the consequences. These are not sanctions against the country as a whole and its people. It's not there to try and economically weaken the country or make it poorer. It's to target those particular individuals who we say are responsible for the violations. So it is a form of individual responsibility, not at the criminal level, but a form of punishment that our government has at its disposal, as does the EU and the US as well. It's a quick and efficient way of assessing the evidence and imposing sanctions. And of course, if the person has a defense, they can bring it forward. If there's no basis for it, then the sanctions can be lifted if things change. But it's there to show that governments take this seriously, they're condemning it, and there are repercussions for the violations that are being committed. We know that these sanctions have been imposed in many other situations. We've seen them in relation to Russia recently, China, other countries. So the government does use these measures, and we're saying it should equally apply in the situation in Tunisia. We are looking to really support MPs so that our Foreign Office, the Foreign Affairs Committee in the EU, will take these actions. And that's why it's so important that you know about it, that you speak to your MPs, you speak to your organizations to ask them, are they doing this? This is not something where they should take the next 6 months or a year to decide in some committee. They have the ability to do it quickly and efficiently. That's the point of the legislation, and we're saying they should use that opportunity without delay now. Secondly, we have also applied to the African Court for Peoples and Human Rights. This is a court established in Africa. It's based in Arusha, Tanzania, and it's there to oversee serious human rights violations that are committed by governments in Africa. So it's like the equivalent of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg here, looking at the EU and the UK. The court has accepted our applications. It has required Tunisia to respond to them, in particular to respond to the urgent application we made for provisional measures. So you can do that, saying while you are deciding this case, we'll make sure the detainees are not harmed, that they have access to lawyers, that they are released with whatever conditions are reasonable and proportionate. It was in fact at the end of this week today that Tunisia are required to provide their response, so we'll know whether they are going to respond or not. And the court will then make a decision on those measures. It will also decide on the actual case itself, the violations that have been committed in Tunisia. We are saying that it's right for the court to be seized of this matter, and they have taken up the case, on the basis that you can't get justice in Tunisia at the moment. There's no effective way of being able to ensure that your rights are protected. The Constitutional Court, in fact, which protects human rights, is not even operational at the moment. One of our applicants at the African court is in fact one of the judges, Judge Akremi, who was sacked from his position by the government. So it shows the possibilities of any effective form of justice are minimal, if nothing. So we're waiting for the outcome of that. Lastly, there's the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Tunisia is a signed-up member, obliged, therefore, to implement the Rome Statute, which we say on the evidence it is violating left, right, and center at the moment. In fact, on Monday, and we'll send this around to all of those here, we are having an event in The Hague focusing on this very issue with journalists, interested parties, stakeholders. We've invited the ICC to attend as well to discuss this very issue. There will also be a Zoom link to it, so you can follow it that way. And we are going to speak, find out the views of persons there, gather as much support as possible, and we have a route to apply directly to the ICC to take up this case. The prosecutor has been visiting many countries around the world who are signed up. We are saying he should go to Tunisia as well, go and see what is happening firsthand. It's not just about focusing on certain countries. Yes, of course, there are many crises around the world, and a lot of attention is going into the situation in Ukraine, as rightly it should be. But it shouldn't only be those countries that are receiving the attention and resources of the ICC. So should others. And so should those countries that are often ones that fall below the radar, that don't get the headlines on CNN. So that is something we are emphasizing to the ICC. We'll be doing that next week, and we'll look at taking steps thereafter to make the necessary applications. It's so important in these situations, legally speaking, to use every available channel that can be taken. So it's a collective force to ensure that there will be justice for those who are detained, that they will be released, that those who are targeted will be set free from that oppression. And also, we've seen the highly inflammatory racist language used against migrants, that those practices are ended as well. So these are our initiatives, those are our goals, and we ask for your support as far as is possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that, I mean, you covered all the areas that one could, possibly ask about regarding the legal avenues. The question is, how much support have the families over here who've instructed you? How much support do they have from our own system over here? I mean, ultimately speaking, we're talking, for instance, today we have Kawthar and we have Soumaya, the daughters of Sayyid Farjani and Sheikh Rachid Ghannouchi respectively. How much support have they received from the legal sector over here?
They can give you more details about their engagements, but there has been some outreach and support from certain political quarters, from MPs in this initiative. There's space for a lot more, though, because those MPs need to be knocking on the door of the Foreign Office to say, don't just say you're considering our application for sanctions, actually consider it and decide. As you've done very, very quickly in other situations, you moved within weeks, even shorter in some cases. So there's scope for a lot more of that support. But the platform for it is there, and we just need to keep up the initiative, and we need as much support from you and others to tell them to do that as well, because that's how it happens in the end. There's no magic to it. It happens by people deciding we're going to do it and then doing it. Stop the talk, just get down, consider it, and do it. Have the courage to do it.
We're moving to Soumaya. Soumaya Ghannouchi is a writer and researcher, and she's the daughter of Tunisia's dissolved parliament speaker, Sheikh Rachid Al-Ghannouchi. So over to you, Soumaya.
Thank you very much, Anas, and thank you to the organizers, thank you to the Cordoba Foundation, thank you all for being with us here today to talk about Tunisia. Well, I should start by saying that yesterday my father turned 82, a joyous, happy occasion for any family. But for me and my family, it's a poignant one. Why? Because my father marks his 82nd birthday behind bars. My father was arrested on one of the holiest days of the year and the holiest of months, on the 27th night of Ramadan, as my family prepared to break its fast moments before the call to prayer, before Maghrib, before sunset. Around 100 security officers encircled our home, raided it, searched it high and low, and took my father away. Why, you may ask again? Because he is the elected Speaker of Tunisia's parliament, because he is the leader of the largest party in the land, because he is the man who led his country's transition from dictatorship to democracy and made enormous sacrifices to give his people a progressive constitution, a consensual constitution that guaranteed their rights and liberties and ensured that no man or woman was sent to jail for their words and opinions. That is his crime in the eyes of a dictator who is, in fact, a political accident in the country's history. An obscure man who claimed to be on the side of democracy and the revolution. But as soon as he got our votes and set foot in the presidential palace, he went about demolishing both. He conspired to overthrow the system that enabled him, an insignificant assistant lecturer, to become the holder of the highest office in the land. In the dead of night, he barricaded Parliament with military vehicles, tore apart the constitution he'd sworn to protect, and wrote his very own instead, literally, and bulldozed over all check and balanced institutions. So, on the ruins of our democracy and the sweat and blood of generations of men and women who fought hard and long to create it, he erected his one-man system, a modern-day emperor, governing by decree, guided by nothing but his own instincts and caprice, driven by greed for power and a deep, dark desire to avenge himself on anyone who dared say no to him, anyone with a history and a record to be proud of, and foremost, of course, Rachid Ghannouchi, with his impressive, extensive body of writings translated into countless languages, and his decades-long struggle against dictatorship. Qais Said turned Tunisia from an inspiring success story, striving arduously to claim its seat among the free nations of the world. He is currently gleefully celebrated by fellow Arab tyrants, the likes, for instance, Egypt's Sisi and Syria's Assad. Qais Said saw Tunisians a big lie, a gigantic lie. He would grant them wealth and prosperity if only they got rid of democracy, a democracy viciously demonized and dismissed as the root of all evil and misery. But as he robbed Tunisians' hard-won freedom, he gave them not only dictatorship, but poverty and state bankruptcy. For the first time in their modern history, Tunisians queue up for hours daily, hoping to get some sugar, some flour, some oil. They're now realizing that their new dictator had turned their difficulties into full-blown catastrophes, their half-successes into complete failures. So whoever wants proof of the havoc, the destruction dictatorship wreaks in nations, look no further than Tunisia and what Qais Said has been doing there. Its people are besieged by crises, by misery, by despair, prepared to board death boats in order to escape to the other side of the Mediterranean. Tunisia today is a cocktail of crises threatening to explode at any given moment. But make no mistake about it, just as the Arab Spring started in Tunisia and flourished there for over a decade of hope and struggle, revolution and counter-revolution, from there it shall return, from Tunisia it shall rise again, bearing the flame of freedom to the people of the Arab region, a region ravaged by coups and tyranny. Because those who have savored the sweet taste of freedom will never be slaves again. And I must end here, I know. I don't want to speak for too long. I will end with a few words to Qais Said, Tunisia's dictator. And I say to him, try as you may, you can never lock Ghannouchi away. You are the prisoner, not he. You are hounded by your sick suspicions, your power greed, your fear. Ghannouchi haunts you. Long before you, Bourguiba had sent him to prison. Ben Ali even sentenced him to death. Both are long gone, Ghannouchi remains. And so too you will be gone. You will join them unlamented, remembered only as a sad, power-crazed putschist, while Ghannouchi's legacy will go on. His undying resistance spirit will go on. His freedom struggle, his struggle for freedom and liberation will live on, and freedom will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Soumaya. Soumaya, one question comes to mind. Surely towards, the end, let's just say. I mean, since the so-called constitutional coup in July of 2021, was there a suspicion that this might happen, that your father will be detained?
Of course, as I said, I think Qais Said benefited from the fact that he's an obscure man without a record. And as soon as he set foot in the presidential palace, he started preparing his coup. In fact, he started doing that even before he entered the palace. He invested in crises. He exploited in the numerous crises, a country in transition, the state of transition to democracy after the revolution was undergoing. So he invested in the COVID crisis, the health crisis, and he withheld even vaccines sent to the country in order to deepen that crisis. He invested in the financial crisis, of course, and in the political crisis with ongoing conflicts with parliament, much of which manufactured, and conflicts with his own government, a government he had himself appointed. So he's been in power now for 4 years, 2 of which holding power, absolute power. But he started planning his coup long before that, as soon as he entered the palace. And I said, he's benefited from the fact that he's a little-known man, an obscure man without much history, really.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Sorry. There's a clip that was produced by the family of Sheikh Rachid Ghannouchi. So let's watch this 4-minute video.
لست وحدك لست وحدك لست وحدك أيها الشيخ العنيد لست وحدك خلف قضبان الحديد أنت راشد لا تنير دروبنا على خطاك لست وحدك أنت من يدعو لكل فضيلة فكرك المجبول بالحب وبالإحسان أنت من يسعى بكل وسيلة كي يعم الخير للإنسان لست وحدك لست وحدك أيها الشيخ العنيد لست وحدك خلف قضبان الحديد أنت راشدنا تنير دروبنا على خطاك سنقطف الحلم البعيد لست وحدك لست وحدك أنت فكر راشد فوق الظنون أنت مثل حالم للثائرين أنت حضن دافئ وأب حنون أنت للخضراء عاشقها الأمين لست وحدك لست وحدك لست وحدك أيها الشيخ العنيد لست وحدك خلف قضبان الحديد أنت راشدنا تنير دروبنا على خطاك سنقطف الحلم البعيد لست وحدك لست وحدك أنت لست ضحية أنت البطل بالحق تصدح عاليا لا تكل تزرع الورد وتسقيه الأمل كل من سار على الدرب وصل لست وحدك لست وحدك لست وحدك أيها الشيخ العليم لست وحدك خلف قضبان الحديد أنت راشدنا تنير دروبنا على خطاك سنقطف الحلم البعيد لست وحدك لست وحدك
I'm going to move now to our next panelist, our next speaker, David Hearst. But before I go to David, we've heard about Sheikh Rachid Ghannouchi from Soumaya as well as from John, and we'll be hearing about Sayyid Farjani from Kawthar imminently. Something that baffles me, and something that I've spoken about several times since this has taken place. And this goes out to our own government, to our own politicians, and we'll be hearing from Phil commenting about part of these things. But if someone like Sheikh Rachid Ghannouchi and like Sayyid Farjani, Democrats to the core, who were ready to sacrifice their freedoms, probably even ready to sacrifice their lives for the future of their country and for democracy and for freedoms and for human rights. If they can be treated in such a manner, with us watching here in the UK, across Europe, in America and the such, what hope do we have in convincing young Arabs, Muslims, in fact, anyone around the world, about the validity of democracy? What future do we have when Democrats can be treated like this with no recourse, with absolutely, the fact that Qais Said was visiting Paris and enjoying the red carpet treatment is in itself a condemnation of everything we claim about our standing by, supporting, advocating values like democracy, like freedoms, and like human rights. So, David, over to you.
Hello, thank you, and thank you for having me. When I look at Tunisia today, I'm really in despair. I hold my head in my hands. But to be frank with you, and you're not going to like this, part of my despair is with Ennahda itself. I'm a reporter, I'm not an activist, and the only thing I can do is my job. And I think with Tunisia, I think I did it. I published a document saying that Kais Saied was preparing something that its authors called a constitutional coup. For 4 days, I was denounced as a purveyor of fake news until Kais Saied himself admitted the document I published was genuine. But what I could not believe was the reaction I got from Ennahda, which was no comment, no help. They didn't take it seriously and carried on as if nothing had happened. And 2 months later, Kais Saied did almost exactly what the document I published said he was going to do. For 10 years, we were told that Tunisia is different. People know how to negotiate, we mediate, we relinquish power voluntarily, we're adults, we're different. We're not headstrong like our brothers in Egypt. Cousins, your father told me, not brothers. The army doesn't get involved. And look what happened. You hand-picked your nemesis, just as Mohamed Morsi did. Morsi chose Sisi as his defense minister because he was religiously observant. And look what happened. What made you back Kais Saied? He wasn't an unknown quantity. He did produce interviews. He did say what he was going to do. I found an interview in 2011 saying that political parties were rotten, parliament was rotten, and the only path for Tunisia was direct democracy. All the things you said made you different. Your constitution, your parliament, your courts, your elections have now gone up in smoke. You're either in prison or back in Ealing. I cannot believe how many strategic mistakes have been made. You start the job and you don't finish it. You think of yourselves as Nelson Mandela, but in fact, this situation requires you to be a Robespierre. And who is going to come to your rescue? This upsets me even more, because Rodney Dixon is excellent and should be supported, but our politics is rotten. And it's far more rotten than it was in 2011. James Cleverly, who's been so active defending democracy in Ukraine, was asked at a Foreign Affairs Committee last week what the Foreign Office would do to get the release of Sheikh Rachid. He didn't even know who the minister was responsible for Tunisia. It's Lord Ahmed. Now, Lord Ahmed is the most senior, longest-serving minister in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He's served under 5 prime ministers. What does he say to Kais Saied? Nothing. He says, we're engaging. With whom? How? There are levers. Rodney Dixon pointed them out. There are courts. There's the Human Rights Council. There are British citizens in Tunisia. There are the courts. Tunisia desperately needs that IMF loan money. There is the International Court of Human Rights. But British policy, from the minister down to the ambassador, has drunk the Kool-Aid and does nothing but repeat the talking points of Kais Saied, just as happens in Egypt or Libya or Israel and Palestine. Starmer is going to be our next prime minister. I know this because MI6 told their counterparts in one Middle East country, which I shall not name, that Starmer is going to be the next prime minister. How MI6 is so sure, I don't know, and I'm sure Sunak would love to know. But when Starmer was DPP, one of his first acts was the extradition case of a computer hacker who had Asperger's syndromes. His name was Gary McKinnon. And McKinnon had hacked his way into the Pentagon and to NASA, not because he wanted to steal any secrets, but because he tested himself. Now, there was a way around not extraditing this poor lad to lifelong imprisonment in America. It was something called the Misuse of Computers Act, and it was a British law, and he could have been tried here in Britain, and khalas, that would have been the end of it. He would have got a suspended sentence. Starmer rejected the humanitarian solution. He blocked it. And he was then overruled by who? By Theresa May, who is the Tory Prime Minister at the time. She had more heart about McKinnon than Starmer did. Starmer was so furious that he flew to Washington to apologize to Eric Holder in person. That's who we're getting as the next Prime Minister. Do you seriously think he is going to spend a minute's political capital on Tunisia? I don't think he is. Now, what's going to happen in Europe? In Europe, you have a whole bunch of countries who equate political Islam with terrorism. This is happening in Germany. It's happening in Austria, my parents' country, who put road signs up saying, "Beware, this mosque is dangerous." It's happening in France when they talk about separatism. And it's happening here with Michael Gove. Do you really think Europe is going to come to Tunisia's rescue? I think you have to think really seriously about what went wrong. You occupied that moral high ground, but you couldn't defend it against people who used really dirty tactics against you. I totally in praise of Rachid Ghannouchi. I think he's a terrific man and a historic figure. And I'm appalled that he's now in the hands of a madman, a complete madman, who restricts all contact with him. That's where we are at the moment in Tunisia. Only thing I can say is that yes, the Arab Spring will break out again, but this time and the next time, you've really got to defend it. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, David. Well, I agree with much of what you said, but you speak as though another was moving on its own. On the field, there was only one player, another, and it could act as it wanted, as it sees fit. You know, when it realized that a coup was being prepared, it could just react accordingly. That, unfortunately, is not the case. Another was one player among many, and one of the very few players keen on seeing the game continue. I might remind you that another only governed, I mean, it's one of the misconceptions about Tunisia that another has been in power for the last 10 years. In fact, another was only in power for 1 year and a half, after which it was overthrown by 2 assassinations, and it chose to leave power for the sake of civil peace. After that, another often had 1 minister in government. So even if it realized that that a coup was being prepared against it, it could not act freely. And you speak, so internally the situation was very complex.
There was in opposition. That's the point.
Well, it was considering going in opposition. Another, you must. So it was even within another. There were ongoing debates of what it should do, because it was in a very tense, polarized, complex situation, and often it found its hands tied. Besides, also, you realize that the power system in Tunisia, the power was really fragmented, and the point was for no party to dominate, but that made it even more difficult to move, particularly as, you know, after 2014, for instance, another, Parliament was headed by neither Tunis, the presidency was headed by Nida Tounes and the government was headed by Nida Tounes. And Ennahda was just keen on seeing the democratic transition completed. That was its main priority, preoccupation, was to finish this transition and to provide some sort of political stability to avoid, the country going back fully to dictatorship. So it was it was trying to minimize its losses continuously. And also, you speak as though another, Tunisia was part of a regional situation that's where, a comfortable regional situation. The fact is not the case, unfortunately. Since the coup in Egypt, Ennahda was delaying the inevitable. Delaying, you have a whole regional environment that is hostile, where the counter-revolution was on the ascendant. So I think Ennahda's genius has been to prolong the transition and to try, as I said, to delay the inevitable.
What have you got left?
What have we got left? And I must say a word about Europe. And Tunisians are not waiting for Europe to come to their rescue. Tunisians have more than enough experience in resisting dictatorship. They did it on their own before, and they shall do it again. And as I say, Qais Said currently is not although he's being received in Europe, he's being received in Europe as their coast guard in Tunisia. Everyone knows you can't work with this guy. This guy knows, only hears the echo of his own voice, and that, he is resorting even to repression because he is very fragile and very weak. And so Tunisians, in fact, what's happening in Tunisia is that the opposition is gaining more and more forces, and Qais Said, even people who supported his coup, incidentally, are turning against him. So the situation is not black or white and it's all doom and gloom. On the contrary, the situation in Tunisia gives us cause for hope because, as I said, the supporters of those who realize that this has in fact been a coup against democracy and that this is turning against them, even the supporters of repression and the coup, that is not just targeting their old enemies in Nahda, and as you said, political Islam and Nahda. So, people are realizing that this is very, very dangerous. Qais Said is losing supporters and democracy is gaining many supporters. So I think I, for one, I'm optimistic. Right. I, for one, I'm optimistic.
I absolutely hope you're right.
I'm optimistic. And I must end with this. They said the Arab Spring was an American conspiracy. I'd say that the counter-revolution is the conspiracy, and that Ennahda's genius has been to try to as I said, delay the inevitable. And the situation, with the coup in Egypt in 2014, everyone expected that Ennahda would collapse in 2014, but it's been trying. It's been trying to prevent that from happening, and it's still working. Ennahda is working with the NSF, the National Salvation Front, which is expanding day by day. So it's not doom and gloom at all, David.
Thank you, Soumaya, and thank you, David, also. Thank you very much. I'll allow for questions later on, but I'd like to move on. I'd like, Oliver, if I may, a few words from you. You are someone who visited Tunisia several times. You're someone who met with Sheikh Rachid. You, forward thinking was very, very present in the aftermath of the Arab Spring in 2011, up until very recently. So your observations in 5 minutes, which I know is a challenge.
Thank you, Anas, and follow that. Thank you, David and Soumaya, for giving realism to our event tonight and the issues. I'd actually spent a week, a month for 18 months in Tunisia, and we were working on a European-sponsored, EU-sponsored program which was aimed at finding consensus among all the different political parties. So for a week every month, we engaged all the parties. And it culminated actually in a conference in which it was based on the potential compatibility of religious and secular understandings of society and governance, which was then led by Sheikh Ghannouchi on the one part and Beji Sepsi on the other, the head of NIDA Tunis then. And I must say, I left Tunisia with lots of hope. I really did think that they had the capability, the drive, and the will to achieve a truly democratic society. And I think the efforts that were made to build democratic institutions that would focus on the individual and collective human rights, regardless of people's religious affiliation or secular affiliation or cultural. There were real efforts I witnessed firsthand in that process. So it's been truly disappointing to see how things have evolved. I think, David, some of the things you've said, I would reflect also. I think in some ways the parties were too mild with each other. You know, there were differences, and there was almost a temptation to overlook those fundamental differences, paper over them, in the hope of actually achieving a unity and working together. That was excellent intention, but there were times I felt in the subsequent evolution where a stronger stand could have perhaps prevented what we have seen. It's a great privilege, and thank you, Anas, and Cordoba for facilitating tonight. It's an enormous privilege to sit here and be able to identify with people who are imprisoned for no other reason than they believed in their country and they believed in their people. And I think that's extraordinary for us to be able to voice our concerns. But I'd just like tonight to use the words of Sheikh Rachid himself, when in July 2021 he wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times. And for me, it actually captures fully the current situation. He said, "On the morning of July 26th, my colleagues and I, all of us democratically elected members of parliament, found the parliament building in downtown Tunis surrounded by army tanks and our access blocked on the orders of President Said. In a televised speech the night before, Mr. Said announced a host of measures, the most startling of which was suspending the work of the elected legislature. He stripped members of parliament of their parliamentary immunity, sacked the prime minister, and consolidated judicial and executive powers in his hands. By doing so, Mr. Said is seeking to overturn the results of an entire decade's hard work by Tunisians who have fought for democratic reforms. I believe his actions are unconstitutional and threaten Tunisia's democracy." How true those words were. And then he goes on, you know, to say what I think is in this article, saying that those who were supporting this coup were actually trying to use the differences between the secular and the religious perceptions of society and how governance should be as the excuse, and he refutes that. And I would refer back to our January 2014, when there was clear consensus, not just between Sepsi and Ghannouchi, who were both present for the whole of the day at that conference, but also numerous other parties, stretching from the far left to the Salafi parties. All were there, but we concluded the day with the belief that in Tunisia, differences can be accommodated. A secular view of society can be compatible with a religious view of society, and there was a will, I think a genuine will at that meeting, and happily we can share some of the findings of that. But there was a will to achieve a truly democratic society with diversity. And it's shameful that it has come to this. I agree entirely with David when you said, David, that Europe won't come to respond in the way we should. I think, Soumaya, it is important because it's not just the will of the people, but there are also big implications of whether we support the structures at present. And all the evidence is that Europeans, and in particular Britain, is carrying on as business as usual. I was shocked the other day to discover that some of our army were out in Tunisia training Tunisians in counterterrorism, probably techniques that are now used to suppress true Democrats in the country, not potential terrorists. And it's that real lack of awareness is shocking. I'd just like to end with the words of another prisoner, and who's been on my conscience for the last 10 years, Azzam Haddad. I remember before the Arab Spring, I was part of a dialogue with Azzam, and we used to meet in Geneva about 3-4 times a year for discussions with European diplomats on how would it evolve if the Brotherhood went into government, long before the Arab Spring. And Azzam said words that haunt me. He said, if it ever comes to the test, you will find European governments will always put their interests before their principles. He's spent, or has spent now, the past 10 years in solitary confinement with ill health, witnessing those words. And for me, as part of our country here and part of the larger European community, I find it shameful that we have not stood for principle, which are our interests, but all the time we have a short-sightedness that sacrifices the genuine interests and values of others for the sake of achieving what we want at short term. Thanks, Anis.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Thank you very much, Oliver. Thank you. Next, we have the daughter of a very dear friend of mine, someone whom for years we worked together on trying to achieve the best interests of Muslims here in this country. But throughout that work, there was never a moment when he forgot about where he came from and about the struggle that took grip of his heart and his mind, and that is of his homeland, of Tunisia. Kawthar is the daughter of Sayyid Ferjani, who's an elected member of parliament, again, someone amongst the dozens who have been recently illegally detained. Kawthar.
Thank you. Thank you again for organizing today. Thank you everyone for taking time out on a Friday on the rare occasion we have decent weather. I just want to quickly touch on a point to continue from what Soumaya has already said about the genius of Nahdha delaying the inevitable. As Oliver said, throughout the years during the democracy that Tunisia tasted, there managed to be more divisive elements of society that ended up working together. And that is also because of the constant olive branch Nahdha kept offering. And I would say that even now, after everything that has happened, after the coup, and after the recent crackdowns, even some parties that may have even initially, or people who have initially supported the coup, are now coming together. And if that wasn't for the 10 years of Nahdha being soft, as some may see it, we wouldn't be in that today. I myself am in a group where I've run with children of various political parties, people that not necessarily would get along, and they are now in a case with us. And again, I would say that was because of the soft approach from Nahdha. So I've been doing various variations of these speeches in the last 4 months, and unfortunately, as time goes on, the violations, absurdities, and the days of my father's imprisonment increases. This isn't the first time my father has been imprisoned. by a Tunisian dictator. I was 3 years old when I first watched dozens of police storm our home and arrest my father. This was in 1987 under the Ben Ali regime. My father was severely tortured using methods that are illegal under international law. His back was broken and he was unable to walk. At times, his torture was so severe, he ended up in a coma for 5 days. Unfortunately, after all the gains, albeit imperfect, of the Tunisian revolution, at 68, my father is yet again paying the price for his commitment to human rights and his participation in democracy. We've known for some time that my father's arrest was inevitable. In fact, his name was leaked in, I think, Middle East Eye after the coup as part of the list of names that Qais Said intended to arrest. On Monday, the 27th of February, my father was initially asked to attend a police interview as a witness. My parents' home was raided, and yet, despite finding no evidence, they decided to detain my father. They eventually sent him to another court 2 days later, and they issued him a prison warrant without charge, and to this day, without accusation. So my father's accusation is, I mean, they're all quite absurd. So he's currently been under investigation, not even formally accused, of possibly being associated with a PR company called Instalingo. Now, as of 2 days ago, everyone who works for this company has been exonerated, but anyone who's suspected of working for this company is either still in prison or prosecuted in absentia. The other absurdity of his case is the political accusation that goes on with this case is to do with changing the face of, changing the political face of Tunisia. Now, at the time, Ennahda were the majority, and also the Prime Minister, Mshishi, who's currently also being associated with this case, was the Prime Minister. So essentially, they're being accused of trying to overthrow themselves. So that's the where we are now. Currently in Tunisia, the judiciary have been taken hostage by the President Said, and we've reached a point where judges were told that they either send these people to prison or be seen as co-conspirators. So currently there is a judge called Bashir Akrami who's currently in prison. And when his family asked the judge who sent him to prison, why did you do this? They said, well, it was either me or him. My father in prison said, we have shifted from the independence of the judiciary to the use and abuse of judiciary. In the last few months, my father has been sent to prison, to hospital a few times. Initially after his hunger strike, where he once lost consciousness while doctors tried to retrieve his blood without uncuffing him. And more recently after being ill due to damp conditions of his cell and sharing an overcrowded cell with over 120 prisoners, most of whom smoke. He has since been back and was given an inhaler, but again to the same conditions. He's reported incidents of violence by inmates towards other inmates, including one with a history of severe mental illness who was seen cutting his flesh and eating it in a sandwich. One who has gouged the eye of another inmate, and one who has been self-harming. He's also received death threats whilst in prison. We believe that they intentionally place these people so that should anything happen to my father, they can say it's not the state's responsibility. During the holy month of Ramadan, my dad was denied the prayer times and when to break or start his fast. They also have placed cameras in his prison, in his prison cell once after he joined. In my father's own words, the case against him is nothing but an attempt to whitewash and normalize the coup and take revenge against his opponents, and we're seeing that today, and is based only on accusations by individuals who've had their honesty and integrity severely called into question. My father has spent most of his life fighting dictatorship and oppression and advocating for human rights, whether in Tunisia or as a community activist in the 21 years he was in exile. As a democratically elected MP and prominent figure in Tunisian politics, my father has played an instrumental role in promoting democracy and human rights in Tunisia. In fact, I'm sure even Oliver would know he would usually be the first point of call when anyone would come to Tunisia to find out who to talk to. People usually would be going to my father first. Unfortunately, despite all our efforts, the EU and the UK have prioritized their anti-immigration stance over human rights, democracy and freedom. And just leading on from what everyone's been saying today, I've actually been lobbying pretty much around the world. The EU, the UK, Africa, and I went to DC. And in fact, one of the bills that they mentioned, that was during a time when I went in May, and whilst there are some Tunisians working in DC, which is only a handful, just lobbying there, we managed to do a lot more than the last 4 months of all our hard work in the UK. And it's purely because of their interests. And unfortunately, often our part of the world is preached. They often preach to us the importance of values of human rights and democracy, and they didn't fail to scrutinize all our parties in the last 10 years when we had freedoms, and yet that suddenly stopped because of their current interests. My father's always believed in democracy and the rule of law, in defending the rights of those who are oppressed, and sends a clear message from inside the prison. I will speak loudly from inside and outside Tunisia, and with those who share with me the belief in the values of freedom and democracy and human rights. And I do hope people today, even some of you today who may not have written to your MP, to please push. I know we're not currently having the most, the best responses, but it starts here. And I'm sure the I just want to say something to the Tunisian government, just quickly. I'm sure they're aware by now that we're not going to tire. We're not going to forget what's happening in Tunisia. My father and those who've dedicated their lives to a democratic Tunisia may be confined to the Tunisian jails you've put them in, or awaiting their sham verdicts, but their ideals and their supporters are not. The more prisoners you create, the more solid our solidarity grows. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kauthar. And I think it goes without saying that all of us here, we stand shoulder to shoulder with the families of those detained and with the pursuit of democracy and freedom in Tunisia and far beyond. You know, I see faces here from Egypt, from many other countries. I'm not going to mention name by name because there are too many to mention, but we're all here in this fight. This fight is our fight, all of our fight. Thank you very much, Kauthar. Next, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Phil Bennion. And Phil is a former MEP for the Liberal Democrats in the UK, and he's currently Vice President of Liberal International. He's travelled from the Midlands to be with us today. So thank you, Phil, and over to you. 5 minutes.
Yes, thanks. Firstly, I just want to say that I'm surrounded by experts today, and that is something that I'm not. I'm very much a political generalist in this respect, and were I not on the panel today, I would be in the audience, because this is, for me, also a means of learning more about the details of the situation. I'll also say that I no longer have my bully pulpit in the European Parliament, where I led for the Renew group on international human rights issues before January 2020. And of course, were I still there, this would have been pretty near the top of my agenda in beating the drum for this on this issue in the European Parliament. And at least, even though Europe's certainly not going to come to Tunisia's rescue in this respect. We were able, because of the fact that we have pooled issues around tariffs and trade and sanctions, then we would have been in a situation, and as to actually put some pressure on. And as Rodney has suggested, the use of Magnitsky-style sanctions, I think, is one way we could progress. Whether we could get those through is very difficult, because obviously we always had a challenge with the European People's Party in the European Parliament, the EPP, the biggest group, who were always transactional, I think you might say, and very, very much listened to their governments at home in terms of national interest. But while I was there, we did see a big change in the attitude of David McAllister, who was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he actually started to realise that you could actually, by being a little bit more courageous, start to actually change things. But that's now 3 years ago, and 3 years down the line, we're one step removed. Now, I did meet Rachid Ghannouchi back in 2012 when the original constitution was being drafted, and it was very, very clear to me that in our meeting, it was only one meeting, but it was a very long meeting, that he was a force for democracy, multi-party democracy, and even though nominally Islamist, he was very much in favour of working across parties, secular and religious, to come to for the common good. And any idea that he does not still uphold those views, I think, is nonsense, because we can actually see the evidence that he has demonstrated over the last 10 years that he is in fact willing and has a record of working across the board. So I think that for one thing we can say legally there is absolutely no justification in his imprisonment. I think the crackdown was definitely predicted, and those of us who are involved in international politics sort of expected it to come, and I do agree that there has been too little in terms of national governments across Europe and our government. They've done nothing at all to press the case and to try and influence Said in any way whatsoever. And I think this transactionalism is a disgrace. I also believe that Said is very much influenced by Al-Sisi in Egypt. And I think in some respect there is a sort of mismatch with timing in this, because what we are seeing with Al-Sisi now, he's driven the Egyptian economy into such a mess that for the first time he's actually started to row back on some of the suppression and repression. For instance, in Liberal International, for the first time in 10 years, certainly the first time since before Al-Sisi took over, we have a liberal party from Egypt that has been allowed to operate and has joined Liberal International this year. So this is a curious time for Said to be following what Al-Sisi was doing 5 or 6 years ago. Normally when I'm in on these panels, I talk about the disgrace of locking people up for their beliefs, because this is what I do with a lot of my political time now. But we've got so many panelists here that are far more familiar with the circumstances, that I think it's worth actually pointing out a few economic facts as well, because what Said is doing is economically not in the interests of the Tunisian people, who need investment, they need to see economic growth, and this is not going to happen under this kind of crackdown and repression. And even though Europe is certainly not going to come to the rescue of Tunisia in terms of trying to oust Said, we in the Renew group, and I'm still very much engaged with them, are really pressing now for a strong economic relationship, a partnership with not just North African countries, but with a lot of African countries, because we have a common interest here. Europe is short of labour. It's also trying to decarbonise its economy. And we are pressing for a proper economic partnership that can help Europe decarbonise and at the same time help African countries actually start to add value and gain investment. We had a whole conference on this in Marrakesh last December. It was the Renew Pact conference, and we're having another one in a 3 months' time or so, to really put some flesh on the bones of how we do this. And of course, the North African countries are so close to Europe that there is so much common interest there. There is land available for solar farms, whether it's you're close enough to attach to the grid. We're talking about producing a lot of green hydrogen. And now this is the sort of thing that can really bring prosperity to North Africa. And I think that because it will be driven from the European institutions, it will require a certain level of good governance. And those countries that are not showing that good governance will miss out. And I think this is going to happen. It's starting from my own group, which is the third group in the parliament. We were getting a lot of interest now across the board, simply because Europe this is in Europe's interest. And so I'm hopeful that, as Soumaya says, the actual political issue can be solved from within. And if it can, I think that there is a strong future. I think Europe will act in its own interests. It will have, it's a win-win situation, I think, potentially for North Africa and for Europe. And it also has some potential to solving the crisis of boats in the Mediterranean sinking. And because if there's more prosperity in those countries, then there'll be less pressure to migrate. I'm just going to finish off with one point on where I can go myself. I mean, I'm here to learn. I've made contact with Rodney. I want to know, I need a good dossier so I can take it to my colleagues, who I still call my colleagues. They still call me a colleague in the European Parliament, to try and press this case. And I think that's one place where I can help. As far as the British government is concerned, I'm not very hopeful, because for one thing, they're not only transactional, they're also at the moment completely disengaged and obsessed with their own survival. And I just don't think that their vision is wide enough to take these things into account at the moment. I just can't see it. But really, we should be pressing our government to put pressure on Said to release all the political prisoners and return to a proper parliamentary democracy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much. And that dossier, I'm sure Kauthar, Soumaya, and the team will be able to provide you with that. Thank you very much. Our penultimate speaker for tonight is a very, very good friend of ours, a great campaigner for freedoms, for human rights, for democracy in her own country, but never is there a fight without her being there. And today she's here for Tunis. Dr. Maha Azzam is the head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, formerly with Rusi and Chatham House. Please, Dr. Maha.
Thank you very much, Anas, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel. Let me take my cue from the title of this meeting, which is, has Tunisia, the birthplace of the Arab Spring, succumbed to tyranny? Let me say that Tunisians and Arabs across the region have known nothing for decades except tyranny. Except for a short hiatus in the Arab Spring where there were free and fair democratic elections, and they lived a year or maybe more, in some cases a year, in my country of origin, Egypt, or more so in Tunisia under some kind of democratic process. They have known nothing but repression, dictatorship, corruption, iniquity, and military defeat. It is the old story of the post-colonial state in the region. And we've heard from colleagues on the panel specifically about Tunisia. But what I would like to point to is perhaps some of the broader political issues, if I may, that affect Tunisia and affect the region. What we see in Tunisia is not dissimilar to what we've seen in other victims of the counter-revolution in the region, which is the domestically the work of the deep state, of security services that have worked consistently against democracy, of oligarchs who have economic interests, who are now again active in Tunisia and have their interests. Perhaps we could have said a little bit more about this on the panel, but there are in each of these countries, Tunisia included, vested interests that don't want to see change or democratization because they don't want to see political accountability or accountability of any kind in the economic sphere. We know how regional powers have interfered in the region, from the Gulf to the elephant in the room, Israel, in order to forestall democracy in our part of the world. We know how the international community has been complicit, and yes, I use the word complicit, through its silence and support of dictatorship, and has gone against its own values of democracy and respect for human rights. And this is something that is consistent with policies of Western countries, even if they may differ from one country to the other in Europe or the United States. But on the whole, what we have seen for decades throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century is nothing but double standards. And that is not going to change anytime soon. Therefore, the question I think before us is what can we do in order to impact the situation, and how really these innocent men and women in prison can be freed. And we call incessantly for the freeing of all political prisoners, for the freedom of assembly, the freedom of speech, the independence of the judiciary in Tunis and elsewhere. But the reality is that the legal process that Rodney Dixon spoke about is political one, remains stifled and stunted. But does that mean that we should be quiet? And we have friends in Europe and the United States. Those in civil society, pain, the young, there is a great deal of potential. This is a long day. The Arab Spring was one round. It was an intifada, if you like. It was an uprising. It was an incomplete revolution. But there will be other cycles, like with other revolutions. It was peaceful, and therefore, and I hope it will remain peaceful as the cycles continue, although there is a big question mark, because we lost an opportunity, and so did the West, for a peaceful transition a reformist transition that could bring democracy to Tunisia and other parts of the world. The future cycles may be different, but it is still within our hands and within the capacity of those in the West to call for reassessment of foreign policy. But this cannot happen without real mobilization among the grassroots in the West and among the work that many of the activists do themselves. Let me come to my final point, and the one that for me really I think we need to all realize that this is a struggle for independence. The independence of Tunisia, the independence of North African states and of the region has not been realized. It is an issue of sovereignty and independence. We still carry on the anti-neo-colonial struggle in one form or another, and to expect that these leaders at the helm are not really still the scions of a colonial project is wrong. The struggle of Sheikh Rachid Ghannouchi and his colleagues and the hundreds and thousands imprisoned throughout the region and in Tunisia, which is our focus today, is that these people were part of and are part of the national struggle. They're not, you can label them what you like. There are different ideologies, but they are national heroes, and they will remain national heroes. They have sacrificed for their country, and they continue to sacrifice. But there will be one generation after the other that will do the same. We have to learn from our mistakes. But let me put it to you this way. The struggle is so hard against military dictatorship in one country, against another dictatorship or a monarchy. And the route that has been taken thus far is one that is very difficult to see success in one uprising. It will take many uprisings. And therefore, the Tunisians, we look to Tunisia today that has, and its people, who face economic crisis, to again be an example to the region as a whole. It isn't an easy struggle. It is a struggle for independence. And as the Arab regimes have united against us, there is a need, a serious need, for the Arab peoples as a whole to unite against them, both outside the region and inside the region, and to say to the West, hands off our part of the world. We want real independence and freedom and respect for our rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mah. That was fantastic. Thank you. And last but not least, someone who knew, lived with, studied Sheikh Rachid Ghannouchi over several decades, and actually wrote a book titled Rachid Ghannouchi, A Democrat Within Islamism. The chairman of Alhiwar TV, one of our sponsors today. Please welcome Dr. Azzam Tamimi.
Thank you, Anas. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa man wala. I hope that we shall meet soon to celebrate not only the freedom of Rachid Ghannouchi and his comrades, but also the end of dictatorship. I am optimistic, David, unlike you, although I share some of your criticism or frustration, yes, indeed. And my optimism is informed by experience. It's been nearly 31 years since I began my working relationship with Rachid Ghannouchi. I was just starting my research at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster. And I invited Rachid Ghannouchi to meet my supervisor, John Keane. And John Keane was so impressed that he invited Rachid Ghannouchi to deliver a talk to our weekly seminar. It used to be every Tuesday. And the talk Rachid Ghannouchi delivered was about Islam and the West. And the reason he chose that title is that those days, I mean, probably some of you in the audience were not born yet, but I think some of us here in the panel would remember very well. Those were the years of Western triumphalism, triumphalism as expressed by Fukuyama's The End of History, by Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations. Those were the days of when George Bush Sr. Liberated Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. Those were the years when the army in Algeria moved its tanks to crush the ballot boxes and kill the dream of the Algerian people. So they were really very difficult times. In Palestine, the Intifada was still raging, but there was a conspiracy to kill it. So all of this informed or fed into what Rachid Ghannouchi presented in that paper, which I translated and read, and then he participated in the discussion afterwards. John Keane afterwards invited me to a cup of coffee and said to me, Azzam, the way he usually addressed me, Azzam, if you want your thesis to be a publishable one, do your research on this man. This is the person that deserves a PhD to be done on. And this is what I did. And lucky for me, because I discovered that I was researching a man who was a true genius, a man whose genius was represented in resolving a real problem that we in the Islamic movement, I won't shy away from saying, I am a member of the Islamic movement, I am a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, who are the victims of dictatorship. Some people choose not to be identified with the Muslim Brotherhood just because they are the victims. They are not terrorists, they never committed a crime, they fought for the freedom of their people. And we in the Islamic movement were struggling with the issue of shura and how shura can be implemented. The concept of shura that is mentioned twice in the Quran. Rachid Ghannouchi, building on a tradition of what we call reformists and revivalists of the 19th and the 20th century, for me, provided a formula that the mechanisms of modern democracy were perfectly compatible with the concept of shura. And that was brilliant on its own. We only needed to practice it. We only needed to implement it. And I think that's why when the Arab Spring started, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in Nahda in Tunisia, and every other Islamic group in the region could not say no to the people who wanted them to lead the change. Of course, nowadays, we can analyze, we can criticize, and we can say, why did Morsi did that and did not do that? Why Rachid Ghannouchi chose this and didn't choose that? That is true. We need to do this. And probably we can organize a conference about this, about the dynamics of change, how we can secure a change. But actually, the most brilliant thing these Islamic movements did, irrespective of whatever misgivings, whatever criticisms, whatever reservations, is that they began the process of change, or they participated in rocking the boat of despotism in the region. And as some of our esteemed speakers said, this is going to happen in cycles. This is going to happen in circles. And that's why we need to be aware that no matter what Morsi did or did not do, a coup was going to happen in Egypt. No matter whether An-Nahda did A or B or C, their experiment in Tunisia was going to be aborted. And my reasoning for this, and that's why we need to discuss this really in depth. And remember, David, we went together to Istanbul to meet several individuals who were very close to Dr. Morsi, and we heard stories that usually the media doesn't talk about. There are three formidable obstacles. First, the deep state, which doesn't belong to the people. The deep state in every Arab country doesn't belong to the people of those countries. They belong to a corrupt elite that doesn't care about me or you, doesn't care about our basic human rights. Doesn't belong to us. It's imposed on us. It's a legacy of colonialism. That's what it is. And then we have the world order. A world order that is so hypocritical. It believes in democracy and human rights within its own geographic borders, but not an inch outside those borders. When it comes to the Palestinians, who cares? When it comes to the Tunisians, who cares? When it comes to the Egyptians, who cares? When it comes to the refugees, whose boat is sunk by the Greek, while everybody is crying over 5 billionaires who insisted, despite all advice, on committing suicide the way they did. Such hypocrisy in the world order is a formidable obstacle. We can try and make the effort, contact MPs, talk to the journalists, do everything. We have to do this, whatever we can. But believe me, the change comes from within. The deep state has to come to an end. Remember the Iranian Revolution? The Iranian Revolution managed to finish off the deep state, and that's why it succeeded. The Iranians remained in the streets. The Iranians gave their blood and they gave their tears and sweat until everything the Shah built in order to persecute and suppress the people of Iran came to an end. They removed at least one formidable obstacle. The regional order represented by those who have the money. We need to do something about it. We need to do something about it, or somebody needs to do something about it. Once change happens within these two circles, who gives a damn about the world order? We will bring about change no matter what. If the people of Tunisia want to see a change, if the people of Egypt want to see a change, if the people of Palestine want to end Zionism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, listen, we have about 10 minutes, so I will allow for 3 brief, either questions or very brief comments. Okay, if you want to direct it to a specific speaker, please mention. I'd like you to introduce yourself, your name and your organization if you're representing anything today. Please, the gentleman here. Who else? Who else? The lady in the 3rd row and the gentleman in the 2nd row. So please, your name and your organization.
Not an organization, just an individual.
Okay, just your name.
Very hard being an individual anyway. Bahauddin is my name. But today, 23rd June, is also a very important day because this is another Nakba actually. 23rd June 1757 is the day when Bengal came under the treacherous occupation of the English. By the way, without Bengal's occupation, there'd be no empire for Britain in Asia, by the way. There'd be no India, the sort of tapestry that was built by Bengal. And also Bengal was the reason why Britain was able to attack China. Bengal was 2 of the largest economies in the world, by the way. In terms of skilled manpower, Bengal was #1. Over 1 million skilled workers were employed. Look at them in China, often forgotten. Anyway, that's by the by. The point I'm making is this.
Yes, please.
In the case of Tunisia, I've got some experience in the sense that I participated in at least 4 demonstrations, by the way, during Habib Bourguiba's regime. I can say this, including the last time when Britain and the United States began to occupy Iraq, the no great nation, by the way, which has been destroyed and decimated by Britain. In fact, it was a country whose leader was actually put into position by Britain. Saddam Hussein was Britain's creature in 1969, I believe. the point I'm making about is about Tunisia is this. Tunisia had an amazing intellectual capital. It's a country which actually was, in many ways, the only proper nation state in the Middle East, in the MENA region. Also, Habib Bourguiba, often discarded as a dictator, actually he did create a nation. And actually he gave a sense of Tunisianness which is not available anywhere else in the Middle East, by the way, for a very long time. The point I'm making is this, that actually this is a country which still has huge potential to become a harbinger of democracy and rule of law, I believe. But I disagree with the last speaker, because I think Islam, which has often become a hook, was a hook, actually a failed hook. Let's abandon it. And I think Dr. Ghannouchi...
Abandon what, Islam?
No, I don't mean Islam. I meant the hook that's used, called Islamism and so forth. I think it should be abandoned. I think Dr. Ghannouchi, by the way, I briefly met him. I do not like Islamism, but I found that he had spoke in a way which seemed to say that actually democracy has a value for the wider Muslim world.
Okay, can you wrap up? Otherwise, we're moving on. Yes.
Unfortunately, Algeria, Dr. Azzam mentioned his name, that country earlier. That country, unfortunately, is acting as the step-parent to the President Said regime. Sad to say, and I think in a way, we have to speak to the European Union, in particular the MEPs in the European Union, and countries like Ireland, I believe, has got excellent MEPs who can be helpful to us. And I believe there is the idea that liberal democracy is something that is valued by at least some of the states in the European Union, if not, unfortunately, Britain's an exception to that. And I believe we should appeal to them that actually Tunisia is a country which deserves to be rescued from this.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. The lady in the third row, and then the gentleman here in the second, and then I'll have you in the front row.
Hi.
Yeah, speak into it. Yeah.
All right. Hi, my name is Ghufran. I'm just a student. I guess my question is, it's very easy for us to speak about hope from the inside, especially as, diaspora. However, this seems to be a reoccurring problem within the political coalitions of the region, is that we speak of a victimization and not offer solutions. So for us to gain hope in some way, or for the Tunisians to gain hope, what is the roadmap that we're looking at? What is the future that we're looking at that we should be hopeful for? And in the same line, sorry to say, considering the complete decimation of moderate Wasati voices in the country and beyond, how does this solution encompass a kind of reinvigoration of public deliberation in the region?
Thank you very much. In the second row, please. Name and organization, please.
Mohammed Kozbar from Finsbury Park Mosque, but
and the MCB.
And the MCB, yes, the Muslim Council of Britain. I'm really baffled and surprised that not a single MP is attending this event and speaking on the panel. I'm sure you probably contacted few of them at least to attend and speak. Despite that the fact we're talking about two individuals, one of them probably a British citizen and the other one is a long British resident in the UK, and their families, children and grandchildren are British citizens. Despite the fact that we're talking about the head of a parliament and a member of parliament. So if MPs don't care about their fellow MPs from other countries and show really at least interest and respect to defend them and speak out to defend them, how people can believe in democracy, how we can really believe seriously that democracy is for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very poignant view. And the gentleman here at the front, if you don't mind. Thank you very much. And by the way, in response to that, I mean, we have as close as that we have in terms of Phil being a former MEP, but no, you're absolutely right. We did contact several MPs. I have to say that a very good friend of ours and someone who hosted a parliamentary event about 3 weeks ago is Crispin Blunt. Crispin Blunt has been absolutely fantastic on this. And he's issued a statement, he's asked a question, he's spoken to the Foreign Office. So he's a really good friend. Unfortunately, he was traveling these days. But you're absolutely right. It's true that if MPs don't care about... Yeah, you're absolutely right. Thank you very much. Yes, please. Your name and organization.
Independent. I would like to thank the panel for the nice evening we had and for the education all of us received. I totally agree with David because he believes in the Middle East, and I've been reading for him since I was a teenager. How old are you, David? For that, so it is really, what you really did talk about and what really happened, it is exactly happening in every country in the region. Yeah. Democracy have a lot of enemies. Yeah. A lot of people don't like us to prevail and to achieve our dreams. But dreams, you achieve it by hard work and not forgetting about your target. And revolution from all the history. The first revolution in the Egyptian history was 3,000 years ago and didn't take long time to develop. We in the first waves of the revolution. A lot of change will happen. A lot of things will happen. As long as we believe in the process of revolution. If you look at the French, the Iranian, like what you mentioned, yeah, takes a lot of time. We discovered, it is really very sad for me to say that, the double standard of the West toward the Middle East. Very sad, because you're talking about democracy. I left my country because I did believe, democracy and all these things, but shocked to find nobody care about democracy. It's only for the elites who can afford democracy. What happened in the Middle East and happening, and all the Western government, from the state to ours, supporting dictatorship, and they know and they understand and they support the system, and they know how the system does to their own people. Yeah. As long as the West keep doing what they're doing, it's totally up to them. But the revolution will carry on and will be within end. Yeah, the true nation will carry on the hard work to achieve their dream.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mohammed. Okay, I'm going to Salim. You have less than a minute. Okay, so.
Thank you all for your contributions. This is to discuss perhaps a different element of what's gone on in Tunisia, and that is in inhabiting and discussing in spaces that are occupied by young people who are interested or...
No, it's on. Yeah, it's fine. It's just low.
Who are part of the Islamic movement. I'd like to direct this to the whole panel, but I know, for instance, Dr. Tamimi and Dr. Azzam have more specialization in this field, so perhaps they'd like to take this question, which is, what are the repercussions on the discourses within contemporary Islamism on the failures of, or the failed democratic experiments in Tunisia and Egypt and beyond? Because already I'm maybe getting the feeling from young people, really, thankfully those who come from a Muslim Brotherhood background do have a strong belief in democracy, and that's something that's overlooked. But those who do not have a Muslim Brotherhood background, what is the repercussion of this? Because we are hearing perhaps the discourse of democracy has failed, Islam and democracy is irreconcilable. That fracture, for instance, if I'm an Islamist, the Islamic project that's worked is the project of Afghanistan, for as obscene as that might sound, whereas Tunisia, where you try to reach out to the liberal factions of society, try to have a discourse on cohesion and cooperation, that has failed. So how do we win back the narrative, and what are the repercussions that Tunisia is going to have on the actual advancement of an Islamic democratic experiment and discourse into the 21st century?
Thank you very much, Salim. Dr. Azzam. Say mum. Okay. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from Kauthar, and then everyone has 1 minute, exactly 1 minute, to sort of either respond, comment, or say their final thoughts. So, Kauthar, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the points I want to reiterate again is about, I have worked with my MP. We are going to see the FCO, so that's one thing that's happening. But it's been absolutely kind of disheartening seeing how my dad, when he came here in 1989, how much he was able to do with his walking stick, picking up the phone and lobbying with the British government, and how we are a lot more, I don't know, organized now, and we've had a lot of efforts made, and I mean, James cleverly seemed like he didn't even know Tunisia existed when he was asked that question. So I just want to say that it's not the end for Tunisia. I mean, it's very weird to ever even think that democracy failed after 10 years. If we look at the history of democracies around the world, they don't just suddenly, it doesn't happen overnight, and there were failures. It's a long journey. It's been a long journey for everyone else, and Tunisia shouldn't be any different. And I think when we start to ask questions in such a, I don't know, doom and gloom way, I think that in itself has made people like Qais win. So yeah, thank you.
Dr. Maher?
Thank you. I'm going to try to respond briefly to the lady who asked about a roadmap. Yeah. And I think that's very important. I think that we have to think about the outside and what we can do, and the importance of the inside in changing the balance of power, over which we can call on those inside different sectors of society, whether it be if there's something left of trade unions of different sectors, doctors' unions, teachers' unions, workers' unions, engineers' unions. We've seen this in Egypt, where there have been some stirrings, if you like, despite the military hold on the state. But in Tunisia, this may be more likely to happen. So inside the balance of power, once it changes, or there are serious murmurs of it changing, then we will have far more clout in pressuring Western governments to review their policy. But in the meantime, all of those outside who believe in freedom and democracy and respect for human rights have to continue working, have to continue contacting MPs and others and academics, and building networks and alliances. And as I say, this is not the cause of Tunisia alone or Egypt alone or other countries of the region. We have to start working together to ensure freedom for the region as a whole. There can be mobilization outside. The outside is extremely important in keeping the cause alive. This is not only the case of the Middle East, it was the case of South Africa, it is the case of Palestine and other causes. The outside is an important echo of the voices of those that cannot speak out inside, so we need to carry on. I was going to add one last word as regards the Islamist movement and the despair of some with democracy. I believe that the great success of Tunisia's Nahda and of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood was to refuse violence as an option. And the minority that think that there is an alternative to democracy and accountability are wrong. It does not mean that democracy has to be in the shadow of colonial ideology. It doesn't mean that Muslims cannot have their identity and that it can inform their politics and their lifestyle. That is their right. It doesn't mean that we have to appropriate French democracy with its laïcism and its secularism. It doesn't mean any of those. Muslims have a right to identify with their religion and for it to form the basis of their politics and their future and their identity and their unity. But what they must refuse is to fall back on what the tyrants have done to them. We will not, and we must not, and our young must not resort to the violence of the terrorists that run our country.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Phil, over to you.
Yeah, I was going to try to answer the young lady as well. I mean, there are a huge number of voices out there across the whole of the MENA region. I mean, we even have a sub-global movement in that just is specific to the MENA region. So we have liberal parties now with pretty well almost every country. Some of them have to be in exile, unfortunately, but they are there. And as has been pointed out, there's also civil society. So I think there are plenty of voices there. I don't think that's what we have to worry about. The issue is how we bring it about. And we need far more resolve from the EU. From Britain is a basket case at the moment, but it doesn't have to stay like that. We need the United States to actually use its influence more in a better way. So we have to help. We have to get international help, but the voices are there, the people are there. We also have to remember, as has been pointed out, that virtually every revolution in history has been followed by a counter-revolution. But basically the direction of travel has generally been towards the progressive. So you get a revolution, and then a counter-revolution, and then basically a move forward again. So I'm very, very hopeful that across the whole MENA region, in Egypt and in Tunisia, maybe Algeria is going to be a little bit more difficult, but it'll happen. You will get a move towards democracy. Even in Morocco, we're seeing a much more active parliament, where we're seeing something a little like moving towards the British system of a constitutional monarchy. So I think there is a lot of hope there, and so don't despair, because basically it's like this man here said, it's going to take hard work. And hard work over a very long period of time, but you have to keep working, and if you keep working, you'll get there.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Phil. Soumaya.
Thank you very much for your questions. Is this working?
Yes, it is.
Right. Well, change is very difficult in our region of the world. We're seeing, that what's happening is proof of that. It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. It's an accumulative process. The revolution was an accumulative process. It didn't happen overnight. It takes patience, and I think one of my father's greatest virtues is his patience. He's a very patient man, but it doesn't mean we just stand still and do nothing. We need to be actively patient. We need to, for instance, in Tunisia inside, although we are, after the coup, people expected, the deep state is trying to restore the old dictatorship, but people are resisting that. So there are some gains inherited from the revolution. People will not simply put up and shut up. People are resisting. You have a coalition being built, people organizing, the opposition organizing its ranks under the umbrella of the National Salvation Front. You have rallies, you have people speaking up. Even in the media, people raise their voices and say no. So we're not seeing a complete return to the old dictatorship in the sense of people, just accepting to go back to the way things were. So it needs time. As I said, for instance, in Tunisia, the opposition currently is working on having a national dialogue that excludes only those who exclude themselves around having early elections, for instance. So the political landscape in Tunisia is very active. It's moving all the time, and it gives us cause for hope, not despair. With regards to the question about democracy and the democratic Islamists, I think for instance, in Tunisia, after the coup, the regime thought that people, by having military vehicles in front of parliament, it banked on the possibility of people being dragged and Nahda being dragged into violence. But that did not happen. And I think that goes to show that the idea, the notion, the belief in democracy and the democratic process is now deeply entrenched within mainstream, I don't like the word political Islam, but within mainstream Islamism, political Islam. Perhaps one of the lessons of the past decade is that although democracy is deeply entrenched, the Democrats need to be fully aware of the challenges and the dangers besieging them, how they can be Democrats with non-Democrats, with people who don't believe in democracy, how democracy can protect itself from non-Democrats, from the counter-revolution. Thank you.
Soumaya. Thank you. David, over to you.
I agree with what you say.
Good. Finally.
However, I once wrote a column saying Sisi is a dead man walking, and he's still walking. 7 years after I wrote it. Dictatorship can last a long time. My only point to Soumaya was that if you get another revolution, make sure you're still in power. Erdogan is known as the hard man of democracy. He's known as the anti-democrat. He's known for lots of things, but he's still in power. You should learn from what Erdogan actually says and does. This is not a game for the half-hearted. It's not a game for reformists. It's a game for revolutionaries. And my criticism is that Ennahda is not revolutionary enough. And they're paying for it. They're paying for it dearly. And if you want to go to, I'm not saying abandon non-violence, but I'm saying be hard men and stay with it and don't compromise. Stay in power and make sure you finish the job you started. And if there's one country I'd go to emphasize that, it would be Latin America. It would be what happened in Chile. It would, when they're all shot in the stadia, where desperate things were happening. What happened in Argentina, what happened in Brazil. Go there and see how a revolution is carried out to the end. That's my only point.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for always giving me a hard act to follow. I'd just like to address the question on democracy. I think democracy is in crisis globally. It's not just Hungary and places. United States and here in Britain, I think we're facing a major crisis of what is democracy. That would be the first question. Second is, I think we failed to take into account the consequences of the refusal to accept the outcome of the Palestinian elections in 2006. That failure, that refusal to accept what was regarded as the fairest and openest election in the region was a green light, I think, to the deep state in all the surrounding countries. It was saying you can delude yourself through the ballot box, you get into office, but you're not in power. And we will abide our times, and because of what happened in 2006, as I say, it was the green light, we will, at the appropriate time, correct the situation, as they say. So I think that for me is the lesson we haven't taken on board and should take on board. Just finally, a word, I think your father, Saeed, and Sheikh Rachid are two remarkable people I know in my life. And I just, if I may, end with the story. When I first met Sepsi, he was deeply, deeply skeptical and suspicious of your father and what he was trying to do. Roll on 2-3 years, and he saw your father as the needed for the future of Tunisia. And the reason, I think, it was the integrity that marked every action of your father, converted, if I can use that word, Sepsi, to say there is real compatibility between a secular stand and a religious stand. And I think there's something there, but it is integrity and the consistency of integrity. And I think Saeed also has shown that and was respected in the Nida Tunis parties for exactly the same reason. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And
well, I have 2 points. One is about the delusion or illusion or whatever, that if you agree to change how people call you, then you will make it. Our brothers in Tunisia thought that Islamism was too much for them. They didn't call themselves Islamists. Others called them, actually. But then they told them, oh, if you are an Islamist, you are a bad guy. So they said, okay, 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 we are not Islamists, we are Muslim Democrats. And everybody then cheered. And it didn't save them. It didn't save, it doesn't matter. What matters is what you stand for. Because they stood for democracy and freedom, they were not aided. They were not helped. They were not supported. This is the issue. The issue is the idea. So they called us, initially they called us in the early 90s, that we used to be called fundamentalists. Then when Hamas was elected in Palestine, they called us terrorists. And then they called us Islamists. And this, let them go to hell. Don't worry about what they call you. What matters is what you stand for. Now, about the point that Salim raised. And I challenge anybody in this world to prove that the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization or is a bad organization. The government of this country invited us to a meeting to help them prepare for the iftar to which Dr. Muhammad Mursi was invited in 10 Downing Street. They were going to receive Muhammad Mursi in 10 Downing Street. Was he a bad guy then, or was he a good guy then? So don't be fooled by these guys, what they call us or what they don't call us. I don't give a damn. Let them call me whatever they want. I stand for the freedom of my people. Now, many young people, young men and young women, thought that these revolutions were going to deliver us. We were going to be mighty again. Our ummah is coming back. And then when the coup in Egypt happened, there was this massive, profound frustration and sense of desperation. It wasn't democracy that failed. It wasn't the Muslim movement that failed. It wasn't the Muslim Brotherhood that failed. It wasn't Mursi that made the mistake. We were being assassinated. Don't allow them to hit on the victim. We are the victims. And we need to tell this to our brothers. And I just finished with one thing. I was profoundly dismayed in 2013, 2014, after the coup in Egypt, when I started hearing some people advise our Muslim Brotherhood members who fled Egypt. They said to them, if you make an interview, if you appear on television, or if you speak to a journalist, always begin by saying, yes, I admit we made a mistake. What mistake? There were no mistakes that justified what happened. No mistakes. And we need to tell our young people, go back to Surat al-Buruj, study Surat al-Buruj, and see what happened to the people there. They were all burned alive. Was that a failure? No, it wasn't. It was standing up to the idea. What matters is the idea. If we die for the idea, we are martyrs. We don't lose. We win. So don't ever be fooled by people who are telling you Mursi failed, or the Ikhwan failed, or An-Nahda failed. No, we did not fail. We are continuing the struggle, and inshallah we will succeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With that, it leaves me only to thank all of you for being here, and also to our speakers. And let's not forget that we had Professor John Esposito online, although with a dodgy line, but he was here. He was ready to take part in this event. My gratitude to everyone here. Thank you. Your contribution was fantastic. And the recording of this is going to be on our website and on our YouTube page. So do look it up and do share it. I'd like to thank all our volunteers today, the security, the catering, everyone here, and specifically, particularly, my two colleagues, right and left hands, Abdullah Faliq, Dr. Abdullah Faliq, who's the Managing Director of the Cordoba Foundation, and Soumaya Ghannouchi from Save Tunisian Democracy. Thank you so much for all your efforts for putting this together, as well as for the technical team, Dr. Abdullah, Islam, and everyone else who's made this possible. Thank you very, very much. The recording will be emailed to everyone who registered on your emails. Keep the pressure on the Tunisian regime under Qais Said to cease brutality and free all the prisoners. The Save Tunisian Democracy slide is in front of you. Support us and get involved with our activities and our events at the Cordoba Foundation. And for media and contact inquiries, please do get in touch with Dr. Abdullah Faliq there at the back of the hall. And thank you so much. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.